The dust had barely settled when the real work began. Not the work of celebration, not the work of counting victory, but a quiet, disciplined ritual that most people today have never even heard of. Because, in Rome, a battle didn't end when the fighting stopped. It ended days, sometimes weeks later, once a hidden machinery of soldiers, medics, and record keepers had finished a task so important that entire military manuals were written about it, and if it was ignored, an army could fall apart from the inside without a single enemy soldier lifting a weapon. Centuries later, archaeologists digging near what was once Castra Vetera uncovered a weathered stone tablet. Carved into it was a name, Marcus Caelius, a 53-year-old centurion of the 18th Legion. The inscription told them he had lost his life at the Teutoburg Forest, one of Rome's most devastating defeats, where entire legions vanished into German territory and were never fully accounted for. And yet here was his name, carved in stone, preserved. How? The answer to that question opens up an entire hidden world, one that reveals exactly what happened in the hours and days after Rome's armies stopped fighting. The first priority, before anything else, was finding the living among the fallen. Small groups of soldiers were sent out almost immediately, moving across open ground littered with the debris of combat, searching for comrades who could still be saved. This wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. Every soldier who recovered was one less soldier Rome had to recruit and train from scratch, one less piece of institutional knowledge lost forever. Those with injuries they could walk off were treated where they stood. Others were carried on stretchers or wagons to field hospitals, where army physicians did what medicine of the era allowed. Those whose condition was beyond saving were still not abandoned. They were made as comfortable as possible, in whatever way the time period permitted. The entire process could stretch on for days, and full recovery sometimes took months. Meanwhile, officers moved through the ranks conducting something eerily bureaucratic for a battlefield, a formal head count, documenting exactly who remained and who did not. But it's what happened next that reveals just how seriously Rome treated its dead and why. The historian Onosander wrote that a general must never delay the proper treatment of the fallen, in victory or in defeat, because it was both an act of reverence and a necessary example for the living. Every soldier watching knew that his own fate, should he fall, depended on what he saw happening to the men beside him. Neglect the dead, and you plant a seed of doubt in the mind of every man still standing, a doubt that could quietly poison morale far more effectively than any enemy could. In peacetime, every soldier received a proper individual burial, but Rome's commanders also understood something practical and grim. Prolonged exposure to decomposing remains posed a genuine health risk to the living. So in the aftermath of major battles, the fallen from the rank and file were laid to rest in large collective graves, or given to the flames in great communal pyres. And yet, even this was not the end of the story for the men who fought. Many soldiers voluntarily set aside a portion of their pay specifically for this moment. A fund that guaranteed their surviving comrades back at the fort would arrange a proper memorial and tombstone in their name, even in cases where no physical remains were ever recovered. Thousands of these stone markers have survived into the modern era, and new ones are still being uncovered. Each one is a small window into a life, a name, a career, sometimes even a family, carved permanently into rock so that someone someday might remember they existed. Which brings us back to Marcus Caelius. His family could take some comfort in knowing that although he lost his life in one of Rome's darkest military disasters, his memory was not left to the mud of the Teutoburg Forest. Years after the disaster, the general Germanicus returned to that same ground and made it his personal mission to see that every fallen Roman there received a proper burial. It's a striking image, a Roman commander walking a forest that had already claimed thousands of his countrymen, determined to give the dead what the chaos of battle had denied them. Of course, not everyone received equal treatment in death. Rank, as it did in life, followed soldiers into the grave. Generals and senior officers were given full ceremonial burials immediately after battle, with the entire army taking part as tradition demanded. Occasionally, this honor extended even beyond rank to ordinary soldiers whose actions on the field made them legends. The writer Appian describes one such case, a centurion named Gaius Crastinus, who led the decisive charge for Caesar's army at the Battle of Pharsalus. When his body was found among the fallen, Caesar didn't simply order a standard burial. He personally granted Crastinus military honors and had a dedicated tomb built for him, set apart near the common resting place of the other dead, a permanent marker of a single act of courage. On rare occasions, Rome went even further, building entire monuments to remember not just individuals, but the collective sacrifice of an army. Emperor Trajan commissioned one such memorial at Adam Clesi, where the names of 4,000 fallen men were carved into a single structure, an almost unimaginable scale of remembrance for the ancient world, with dedicated ceremonies held on specific dates to honor them. But what of the enemy? Here, Rome's carefully organized compassion came to an abrupt end, and the story takes a much darker turn. Wounded soldiers on the losing side were sometimes given care, but rarely out of mercy. Healthy captives commanded high prices, and those who could recover were kept alive purely for their value as forced labor or as bargaining chips in negotiations. Those whose injuries left them with no value to their captors were shown no such consideration. High-ranking enemy nobles fared differently still, not because Rome valued their lives more, but because they represented lucrative political leverage, useful for ransom or diplomatic exchange. During the Second Punic War, the Roman general Scipio Africanus released a captured Numidian prince, Massiva, specifically as a calculated gesture to win over his uncle Massinissa to Rome's side. It worked. Political marriages of convenience weren't the only currency of war. Prisoners were, too. But Rome's own soldiers weren't immune from this same cold calculation. After the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, when survivors had been taken captive by Hannibal's forces, the Roman Senate made a decision that shocked even its own citizens. They refused to pay the ransom demanded for their release. Meanwhile, Rome pursued a strange double standard. It went to considerable lengths, tracking down Roman citizens sold into captivity by enemies abroad, demanding their release as a condition of peace treaties, while offering no such protection to the countless people Rome itself had captured and sold in the aftermath of its own victories. While the living were sorted, and the dead were honored or discarded depending on rank, another quieter economy was unfolding across the same ground. Smiths and craftsmen combed the field for salvageable equipment. Broken armor was repaired. Weapons were stripped from the fallen, friend and foe alike, because Rome's war machine could not afford to waste resources. After the disaster at Cannae, the historian Livy tells us Rome was so desperate for equipment that it pulled enemy weapons out of storage, pieces that had been kept purely as trophies, and handed them straight to its legions. It's a strange thought, an army marching into battle carrying the very weapons of the men who had defeated them. Small, cheap items, arrowheads, sling bullets, broken fragments, were often left behind, too damaged or too scattered to bother collecting. Which is exactly why, when archaeologists excavate ancient battle sites today, these are the objects they find most often. A complete, intact sword or helmet is an extraordinarily rare discovery because it had to survive not just the chaos of the battle itself, but centuries of scavengers, and later, generations of treasure hunters. Then there was the loot itself, and this is where Roman discipline was tested to its limit. Officially, nothing on the battlefield belonged to the common soldier. Every coin, every piece of jewelry, every valuable object legally belonged to the general, who represented the authority of the state itself. Soldiers were expected to hand everything over, to be counted, processed, and distributed later, usually as cash payments after the campaign's end. But human nature rarely follows official policy. Soldiers and camp followers alike would slip away in the chaos, quietly claiming small, easily hidden items, a cloak, a pair of boots, a piece of jewelry, anything that could be concealed and later sold. Stumbling onto an officer's abandoned tent could mean walking away with furniture or a luxury saddle worth months of salary, if you could carry it home without getting caught. The historian Polybius captured this tension perfectly in his account of Rome's victory at Cynocephaly. Roman soldiers, having chased down the fleeing enemy, began stripping the fallen and rounding up prisoners, only to discover their allies, the Aetolians, had already reached the enemy camp first and claimed the richest spoils for themselves. Furious at what they saw as a betrayal, the Roman soldiers turned their anger not on the enemy, but on their own allies, accusing their commander of handing over what should have rightfully been theirs. It's a small, human detail buried in an ancient text soldiers who had just risked their lives, arguing bitterly over a stolen cloak or a piece of silver. Occasionally, a general would reward his men by granting complete freedom to loot a move that boosted morale, but came with real risk, since Rome still expected a share of every campaign's spoils to be sent back to the capital. And in practice, this kind of free-for-all created its own dangers. The first soldiers to break formation after a victory were the ones who claimed the best spoils, while those assigned to bury the dead or carry the wounded were left with whatever scraps remained. It's easy to see how quickly resentment could spread. Soldier against soldier, and sometimes soldier against the very officers meant to keep order, which raises the real question hiding underneath all of this. The same question that has fascinated historians for centuries. Just how far could this tension go before Rome's legendary discipline finally broke down completely? Where was the line between disciplined soldiers quietly pocketing a stolen cloak and an army turning against its own command? That story, one of Rome's most dangerous internal threats, is one we've told in full elsewhere. But for now, remember this. The battle you've read about in the history books was never really the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a far quieter, far stranger one, a story of bones and coins, of memory and forgetting, written not on the battlefield, but in what came after.